industry guru and executive, is the founder of his own company, The Dynamic Sale, a learning, a coaching, and development company. The Dynamic Sale enables individuals to shatter their performance expectations in the staffing and recruiting industry. He's done it all: permanent, temporary, placement, sales, branch management, regional management, COO, and president. So, Neil, without further ado, I will turn it over to you. Oh, by the way, I did want to mention, if anybody does have a question for Neil during the course of the program today, there's a question feature in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can just type a question in there, and at the end we'll do a little Q&A. And then if you want to minimize your control panel, up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, there's a little triangle, two triangles that you just click one time, and you can minimize that and get it out of the way of the screen. So sorry about that. Neil, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very kindly, and hello everybody from across the nation. You're here for Growth Margin Method. Before we get into it, Mark did a great job on the intro. I just wanted to fill you in a smidge more on my expertise and how I can help you. I have most recently, up until last year, been the global president of the finance and legal lines for Adecco. And before that, I was president and COO of Agilon Professional Staffing for about 6 years. So I've been in the business for 20 years, and I really ran every desk imaginable. And, as you can imagine, starting as a perm recruiter, perm placement was my life, but it quickly became very obvious to me that I needed to become an expert on temporary staffing in order to further my career, especially in the larger companies that have both temp and perm. So I really wanted to take everything that I learned on the permanent side, and there was so much great stuff out there for permanent placement training, but very little on temporary. In fact, back then, there was nothing out there on temporary training. It was all generic sales or permanent placement. Today, it's still tough to find a lot of placement training specifically geared towards temporary placement. So I thank you for coming. Spread the word. This is a great session. It's one, with all my material, I take a bit of a different spin. I try not to give the same old that you normally would hear, and I think that's super important on a topic such as gross margin. And I laugh because when I was, long before actually, before I was president, when I was a VP or branch manager even in my companies, at all of our national meetings and training, we would always talk about gross margin, and you would literally freak out if you were the one picked to talk about gross margin because it was beaten to death. It could easily be an incredibly boring topic, and I got good news for you. I don't think you'll find today boring at all. We're really going to get right into it and talk about what I have identified as being the real keys for gross margin. Okay, now I'm going to move ahead. If you have any issues or questions, anything with technology, you could certainly use the question feature that was on there. Okay, so the thing with margin, of course, everyone wants to get higher margin. It's innate that we want to do it, but people have such difficulty doing it. So what I'm going to share with you are really the tricks and the tips that I have used in branch after branch and region after region, and in fact, the techniques that I use in my company to take us from really amongst the lowest of the margin operating units to the very top. All right, so look, there's always hard work involved in it, but the concepts and the fundamental basics, if you will, behind this are relatively easy if you're committed to doing it. So these are proven techniques that have worked. So look, if this was a live seminar, I'd ask you, well, how do you raise your margin? And look, it's academic. The answers are, really, pretty easy, right? You can either increase your bill rate, obviously, or the opposite, you lower your pay rate, okay? So, but what I'm going to share with you is what really happens on your desk. Now, I don't know, what your role is. Some of you out there run a desk. Some of you out there do outside sales, and you're responsible for some of the pricing. Some of you are division managers or an owner or a branch manager, and you're looking at ways to increase your staff's margin. So doesn't matter what your role is, take these tips. If you're an individual, look, there's no one that's going to force you to do this. So the discipline lies on you. Now, if you're a manager, they're not going to do it, and they need you to help them through this. So, we're really going to talk about some of the fundamental basics behind pricing, okay? So the thing that I noticed whenever I would deal with a branch or an individual with low margin is that there was something wrong. So I would always want to look at the individual or the branch or the group and find out what's causing this. What are their margin and what are their habits? Now, the thing that I noticed time after time is individuals had habits that permeated throughout every deal that they did. Or a branch all priced the same way and different from a branch that might be 10 miles down the road. So, again, habits are an incredibly big part about what happens. Now, most people will focus on one side of the equation or the other, either on the bill rate side, and they have a way that they do it, but they still fall into some habits I'm going to talk about, or they focus on getting the right candidate, and they let the candidate drive it, and they work on a margin or a markup on the pay rate side. Okay? The key, of course, is you need to focus on both sides of the equation. Right? So, let's look at this, obviously, and I don't, this slide, I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on, but look, the objective of pricing is what? You want to maximize your margin or maximize your spread by getting the highest possible bill rate you can and the lowest possible pay rate under the circumstances. Now, the under the circumstances, to me, is the key and the essence of the whole issue that we're talking about here. Now, under the circumstances mean that every order needs to be priced differently, and they're not, right? Every candidate and every job order is different. And again, I need you to make sure that you really realize this in going forward, that you really break any habits or, general approaches you do, and that you price them out very differently. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. All right, so how do you price? All right, I've seen that, some people have bill rate ranges, which I suggest that you all do and you all have in your branches. All right, so ranges for a particular job. But some people have these ranges, and they will always quote that based upon a job title. Okay, some people will look at a similar job, one that you might have filled recently or one that you have out working now or one that you filled a week ago, and then based upon the rate that you did then, you're going to quote that similar rate. Okay, other people will, do whatever they do to come up with a bill rate, and it could be a range or whatever, okay, or frankly, it's probably your personal preference for that type of job. And then I see people that take this number, and this is super common, and they divide this by a markup, right, or they multiply it by a margin factor to then back into a pay rate, right? So if your margin goal is, X percent, you use that to then figure out what you should be paying the person based upon this bill rate that you figured out. All right. Other people, as I mentioned, they do the opposite. All right. They figure out, all right, I know what this job is. I know what the candidates are requiring. All right. This was especially common when candidates were driving the market more, but it still happens all the time. So, all right, this job is going to pay X based upon my inventory. And then what so many people do, again, maybe this is one of your habits or someone that you know, they then take that pay rate and then they multiply that by a markup to arrive at what the bill rate should be. Okay, so do any of these sound familiar to you? Okay, and if so, which are they? You really do need to find out the habits that you have, and again, just look at what you have fallen into, really. How do you price, and why do you do it that way? That's a big part of the problem, that we're going to talk about when we get into this methodology. Okay, the pro-pricing steps. All right, so let's walk through it. Again, I don't think it's rocket science, but I think this is great stuff that is absolutely going to help you increase your margin. All right, so let's get right into what this means. Obviously, the very first step we have to do, and we're going to come back to the habits and all of that later, okay? But you, of course, have to take a phenomenal job order in an interview. You need to get all of the information. You've all been trained on this. You all get it. But it has to come back to pricing, not just for closing the deal. So taking the job order, we need to know all of the things that I'll get into in a bit. We need to know how long the order's been open for. We need to know the volume of the business that we're going to get at this client. We need to know the urgency that the client has. We need to know the steps that they've done. You know, where are we in the process? We need to know whether they're interviewing the temp or not, things like that. On the candidate side, we need to know basically how desperate are they? What is it that they really want? What are all of their hot buttons? What are the things that are ideal for them? All of the things I'm not doing a training on the job order or the interview, but I want to make sure that anytime you price any job ever or you pay anyone for any job ever, you're always remembering to go back to all this information and not relying on a simple habit of just creating a price based on some of the things that we talked about. All right? Within the interview process and the job order process, we always talk about stretching the spec or stretching the asking price. So is this something that you always do? Again, you remember this from your basic training, but when you're in an interview and someone says they're going to work for $20 an hour, do you put $20 an hour on your computer or the application? Do you always stretch it? Do you always find out, look, if we were to find you something with hot button X, Y, and Z, that's your perfect job, based upon all of these things that we just talked about, how would you feel about getting a phone call at 15 an hour? Oh, no way, 15. All right, so you don't even want to hear about it. Well, maybe I'd hear about it. All right, then 15 becomes that number, right? Again, not trying to insult you with some basic training, but that's the key for stretching this. We cannot just put in what the minimum the person asked for, because on an interview, as we know, what people tell us their minimum is really, it's an objective, it's a goal, it's a wish, but it is not the must. For some people it is, for many it isn't. So we really need to go back to this and recognize that there is room, of course, to play with on the price side. Okay? Same deal on the job order side. And look, I think most people know that you need to do that, and clients have always been sensitive to price. So, I'm sure you're doing your best, but we still need to stretch it, especially if they give you a number and they have a budget. We need to feel it out and see their thoughts about even talking with or seeing someone that we think can actually be cost beneficial to them, but their hourly rate might be a little higher. Okay? So let's assume you've all done that like champs. You now all remember to go back and always use this info. This next bullet is the key to the method, and it's treat the pay rate and the bill rate completely separately. Think about that for a second, because most of you don't do it, and I don't mean to be assumptive. But most people put these all together. The key to pro pricing is you deal with the pay rate first or second, but you deal with it separately, and then you deal with the bill rate separately. The concept of a margin or a markup is an after-the-fact concept. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you were ever using margin or markup in the way that you price or pay someone, you're doing it wrong. Okay? Again, what do I mean by that? But Neil, we're trained on margin, or I train my people on markup. They need to know this. You're crazy. I agree with you. They need to know it. You need to know it. But not at this stage. When you're coming up with your pricing and your pay rates, okay, they need to be separate. What you then do is when you're done creating the best pay rate given the situation and the best bill rate given the situation, then when you come up with your pay rate and your bill rate, then do the math. Then see, all right, what kind of a markup does this come out to? What kind of a margin does this equate to? Okay, so that's what I mean by it's a thermometer or a barometer. That'll give you an indication of perhaps whether you're too high or too low. And again, I'm going to get into that a little bit because these are just the steps, okay? You need to know what you have in terms of your inventory. That's key, of course, for determining your price with supply and demand. All right, and finally, when you're going to quote someone a lower pay rate than they want or someone on a higher end of the bill rate range, don't be afraid to throw it out there and just wait and be quiet. It is a tip that I give constantly in any sales training, because the fact is And believe me, I've done this with thousands of people, and I'll watch them do it, and it's just really easy to get nervous when you come to sensitive things like someone's pay rate or a bill rate. And the odds are that we end up talking more than being quiet. So again, when you throw it out there, be quiet, because there's crazy tension on any closing question. You know, the example I give for any selling question is, could you imagine 10 seconds of silence? 10 seconds doesn't seem like anything big, but look at how the tension builds up. When you're a candidate and you told me you wanted 20, and I tell you, look, but this job, I think it's great for the following reasons, but I could pay you 15, 22. All right, that was only 5 seconds of silence, and I couldn't, keep quiet anymore because I thought some of you were going to log off. Okay? My point is, just make sure you always remember that good old-fashioned technique. So, okay, so let's revisit some of these key points, and then we're going to put them all together, and again, really give you some good tips here. So, all right, taking the world-class job order or interview. All right, so I've already told you why that's important. So, look, these hot buttons are key because obviously, the more hot buttons that any opportunity or assignment has, based on that person, the more reasonable they will likely be for what they get paid. Doesn't that make sense? Right? Look, think about it this way, and I'm going to get into this also later, but we know that when we have a job for someone, or an assignment, and it doesn't meet their hot buttons, we'll still call them if we need to, but what do they do often? They're going to say, well, look, I told you I wanted to commute close to home. I now got to head into the city, or I got to, pay extra tolls, or it's longer hours than I wanted, so, yeah, I'm not going to do that for 20 an hour. I'll do that for 25 an hour, 30 an hour, whatever the number is. Okay, so that's just the opposite point. But the closer we meet someone's hot buttons, the more flexible they will be, or the more flexible they will be when you sell them on it. So, again, just remember to always get this. And if you're filling the job on someone you didn't interview, then start getting nasty with your coworker, or, frankly, you then have to call the person up yourself and do a two-step, sort of pre-interview them, tell them, you have a couple of things, but, you don't know enough about their background. Let me ask you a few questions, okay? Find out all the hot buttons, all the ways that you've been taught to do it on the interview process. So, look, what do you want in your assignment? What are you looking for? How important is temp to perm for you? What have some of your other assignments been like, if you've temped before? What did you like about them? What didn't you like about them? Look, you're on one now. Why are you looking to switch to a different one? What's been missing? Okay? And more about the general. Look, if it is a full-time opportunity they're looking for, what do they want in a full-time job? Why did they leave their last job? Why didn't they take other temporary assignments or permanent jobs where they've gone on interviews? All of these questions that you've been trained on are critical. Again, most people use this because they want to close the person later on or come in handy. Well, this is the time pricing, especially on the temp side. Here's where you need it, okay? So, again, we, in essence, want to figure out the desperation meter, right? And I hate to use that word, but the more desperate someone is, obviously the more flexible on price they're going to become. The more stringent or specific someone is, the more you're able to give them exactly what they want, the more flexible that they're going to be on it. Okay, the person that's just in it for money, they don't care about anything, they're going to be less flexible. If someone, when we want to look at their availability, we want to look at where they stand in the market. If someone's got great skills, that no one else has, obviously you know what that's going to do to price, okay? So I don't think I can beat the stretching concept to death anymore, other than you need to always do it. And this is such a fundamental training approach that about everyone I've ever worked with has heard of it and agrees with it. But I got to tell you, when I would end up reviewing and auditing the habits and looking into the details, how often do you think I really found, especially on the temp side of the business, that the temp price was stretched? And I am shocked to tell you that it was far fewer than it should have been. I mean, most of the time, People would just come in, and you would find out what it is that they said that they wanted, and that was the end of it. Okay, and the same with the job order side. So just make a note of this. You know to do it, but are you doing it? If you're a manager, go in and look at the applications, look at the interview notes, and see exactly what they did. I mean, stretching is critical because, again, if we get the pay rate down a bit, we raise our margin. And if we get the bill rate up a bit, we raise our margin. If we get it on both sides a bit, we raise our margin even more. Okay? On the candidate side, I need to make sure you always stretch it so that you know what the rock bottom is. Again, don't fret if you don't have this information because you can always do a two-step, as I mentioned, and call them back. Okay, so rock bottom. That means if someone wanted 20 an hour and you come in and say, hey, let me ask you something, 18 an hour, let's say I get something, again, it meets all it's everything you want. It's close to home. Repeat the stuff. All right, it's temp to perm, which is what you want. It's temp to perm in the auto industry. Let's say they want that. Okay, again, the closer it is, and they say 18, sure, don't leave it there. Stretch it to smithereens. All right, if they said 18, you now have to take it a step further. All right, let me ask you this then. What about 16? Now, odds are they're going to say, no, 18. Okay, but understand what I'm saying. Of course I'll get you 18 if I can, or even 20 or even more. My question is, how open are you to at least hearing about or being positioned on or presented to an assignment that, at least in the beginning, they're saying they might only pay 16 an hour. But again, Mr. Candidate, it's going to go temp to perm. It's in the auto industry. It's a block from your house. It's all those things. Okay, and you keep doing it until they say no. I'll tell you what, 15, don't even ever bother calling me. In fact, if you call me, I'm going to be highly insulted. All right, look, this is not a session on interviewing, but I need you to make sure that you are doing this and using it because the key to increased margin lies right there. If you did nothing else that we talk about today, nothing else other than this candidate increase or increase in margin by the decrease in their pay rate, your margin's going to go up significantly, okay? All right, so this treating the pay and the bill separately. I hope and I think that you got it, but I need you to be honest with yourself and take a second to reflect back on the last couple of fills that you had or assignments that you placed, and I need you to think about them. Why did they end up being priced that way on the pay side to the candidate and on the bill side to the client? Okay? So, look, lay this out, and this comes back to what I opened with. On the pay side, when you're figuring out a pay rate, ignore the bill rate for now. Ignore it. I want you strictly to focus on this candidate and how this matches their hot buttons and what the candidate situation is, what the job market is like, okay? And pay the lowest that you can get away with, knowing what you've learned on the interview, okay? And again, really how this all meets what it is that they really want. Now, in a live session, the hands would be going up right now, and you would say, Neil, aren't you being a bit of a pig? We can't undercut our candidates. Maybe we don't hear this in this market as much, but we can't undercut them because they're going to walk off on the very next assignment that that they get, or we're never going to get good candidate referrals. That's why I said the lowest that you can get away with, and knowing what you know about this candidate. Okay, that's the whole key to it. Based on this candidate, they're a dime a dozen. I've got 100 of these. The competition for these jobs are crazy. This, you're really good. You're one of the 5 I want to use for it. This is pretty close to your home. It meets most of your hot buttons. Based upon this, I'm going to go low on my pay scale, right? I'm going to go low on it. Okay, that's the concept there. And, again, the same deal on the bill rate side, okay? We're going to ignore the pay. We're going to ignore, what the candidate said they wanted. Certainly, if we know that candidates are going to want a lot because, well, why? Because, they're highly in demand and there's so few out there with this job skill. Oh, we're not going to ignore that. That's all about how we're going to figure out what the bill rate should be. So, again, the highest that we can get away with, knowing what we know. All right? And let me just, before I come to the next slide, now think about supply and demand, and I might get into this in a later slide, but I just want you to get the concept because we've all studied it. We all know what it means, But it's a real funny thing, in our business. We get killed on both sides, okay? Now, what happens in a recession? Well, our business gets killed because we get doubly hit. The demand for our product and services decreases, right? So that naturally, the demand lowers prices in and of itself. And then the supply of what it is that we sell goes through the roof. And that in and of itself lowers pricing. And then the combo of the two, boy, our prices and margin get whacked in a recession, right? So, okay, well, the good news, if we want to look at a silver lining, is, well, we don't really have to worry too much about, the law of economics working on the pricing side when it comes to bill rate, right? Because our clients will let us know that the game has changed, and this is all that we can pay, and, here's what we're going to do. And you've all felt it. You all know the challenges in a business slowdown when it comes to the bill rate side. But what about the pay rate side? Again, if this were live, I would want to hear stories from you. Well, I mean, we're live, but, again, if we were physically in a room together, I would want to hear stories from you about candidates that have come up to you where you paid them $20 an hour, last year, and you call them up for a job, and they say, what's it paying? And you say, you just came off a job for us at, $20, and I'm going to pay you $20. How many of these people say, hey, Neil, listen, that's real cool of you, but I think you're real. I'm surprised that you're willing to offer me the same. I mean, the law of supply and demand, I know the jobs are far fewer out there. I know that there's far more people out there fighting for the same position. I know pay rates have been dropping, and salaries are dropping, so please, let's be more reasonable. I'll do it for $17, right? It doesn't happen. So I'm being cute, but that puts a huge onus on you to make sure that you are doing the right thing with pay rates and you are adjusting them accordingly. It is why margins always drop in a business slowdown. And they arguably shouldn't if you were able to get your candidate side to catch up faster. Now, if you did a study in your branch or your desk, or you were on multiple branches, you're going to be able to see different trends on pricing. And some people are more aggressive on the candidate side than the other. But my point is the law of supply and demand says that in a business slowdown, that the candidate side should drop a bit, okay? So, again, I just want you to think about that, okay? So here are some of the things that, I raced through before. And these are all the things that when it comes to the bill rate side, irrespective of the pay side, that you're going to think about, right? So, think as I go through these, think to yourself, is this going to make the bill rate on the higher end of the range or the lower on this one order? So the volume of orders, if it's a client that gives you a lot of business, answer is, all right, obviously if it's someone that gives me a lot of business, I'm going to be more flexible, and I'll certainly come down from my highest end. If it's a large company or large potential in future business, no, I don't want to do it like some person that has one job and I'll never hear from them again. Yes, so the more the big potential, the more flexible I'm going to be, and I'm going to err to being more generous with the bill rate that I charge. The client expectations or budget. We need to know that. Do you ask it all of the time? So many of us forget to do it because we've just gotten in the habit of pricing a certain way. So we really want to know what it is that they expect. Again, odds are it's not going to be as high as you want, but you need to know where they are. If a client expectations are on the higher end, then, well, we can, that probably can influence our decision to go on the higher end. Is it a previous relationship or a new one? Now, again, this one is not an easy answer because the answer is it might make it go to the higher end or the lower end of the range. It depends. If it's a previous relationship that really gets your value and is willing to pay for value, and you know that, then you go to the higher end. If it's a previous relationship where you know that they're real cheap on it and you've lost deals because of it, and they're more sensitive to it than they should, then maybe you come on the lower end. If it's a new client, it depends. You don't want to set your first bill rate super high, but you also don't want to set the stage for it being super low. So it just depends. They're new. What are their expectations? How big are they? Okay. Next one, the sellability of the job. How sexy is this assignment? Boy, if it's a really great industry, a cool company everyone's dying to get into, well, hey, we know we can get someone on the candidate side cheaper. We could absolutely, factor that in. We know it might convert to perm. It's a company we really want to get in with based upon that. We're going to be more flexible on our charge, okay? What's the competition on the job? And again, this is going to depend. If there's a lot of competition, it doesn't mean that you lower your fee or your rate. And the opposite doesn't necessarily hold true. It just depends what's the competition and how long has it been open. So if there's a lot of competition on the job and they're all good and they've been in there a while, you're probably going to want to go to the lower end of your range so that you can get in there. Okay? Next one is an interview required. And I want you to write this down somewhere. I want you to start. And please, if you don't take anything else from this webinar, even what I said before about separating the bill and the pay, I want you to write this down. If an interview is required for a temporary assignment, go to the high end of your range always. Okay? Again, I use always, maybe being a little funny, but really I would say always. Now, why do I say that? Well, for one, you shouldn't have to interview for a temporary job. I know most of you don't, but I know many of you in a business slowdown have to, and many of you when times are good still have clients that insist on interviewing people. Well, it's sensitive, or it's reporting to a key person, or it's real long term, or we think this thing might go temp to perm, and we want to get the best person in there. As soon as you ever hear that when taking a spec, I want you to have the gumption, and again, I might have used a different term for it, but I don't know my audience well enough. So let's just say you have the gumption or have the you-know-what, okay, to charge on the higher end of the spectrum. Now think about why, okay? Anyone have the answer to it? Have you figured it out? Because it's really just like the puppy dog clothes. But the bottom line is people buy for emotional reasons, whatever they buy, and then they back it up with logic. Once someone goes through an interview, and once they end up seeing your person, and they like them, and they've become human to them. They've connected with them. They're the ones they visualize on the assignment. They're the ones they see taking the place of this person for the maternity leave or the project or whatever. They are the person that they want, and they will become less price sensitive. I don't mean that still makes all clients not care about price. I just mean you have a significant card that you get to play, a significant one. But, Neil, I might not even get the interview if I price it too high. Well, don't give them a price. Tell them it's going to depend upon the person. If they interview, they'll be happy to accept the range. And, frankly, you can let them know and feel them out. Look, this one, is going to probably be on the more expensive side, but I want you to meet them. It really is not an issue when people are interviewing. Again, if you don't buy this or you're thinking of stories where it didn't work, my point is that, okay, there can be a max that the client is willing to pay, but you're going to be at the top end when they require the interview. Because even if they came back after, and this is big in perm training, I mean, it's just like a client coming in after they've interviewed and decided they want to hire your person, and they say, by the way, Neil, I'm not going to pay your 30% fee. I just talked to my boss and all the other agencies. We're doing it at 20. So, this is our number one, but we'll go to the number two if you don't do a 20% fee. The answer is it's done. Your deal is done. It's finished. You've made a placement at 30%. So please, interviewing is not good for the temporary business. We know that. You want to be able to drive the direct fill. You want to be able to get out the competition. You want to get good at doing this, okay? And this is key for you to understand, though, that when you can't, boy, this gives you a significant card. On the same note, if an interview is required and there's competition, and you can get the client to ignore the competition and not have interviews to allow your person to start this afternoon or tomorrow, then what does that mean? Well, that means you'd absolutely be willing to go lower on your bill rate, right? So again, we're only halfway through this list, and these are the things that you need to do on every order. The good news is, Look, if you're in a, and we'll talk about this a bit, but if you're in a contract, then you're going to discuss that mostly up front with the client anyway. And again, you still take all these things into account. But all right, so what stage of the process are we in? Again, I think we covered that, but if this position's been open and they've been interviewing and now they're finally giving you a crack, hey, I got news for you. They're going to be less price sensitive the later the stage in the process. The earlier it is, again, all things being equal, they'll be more price sensitive. The difficulty in finding the person, we've already talked to a couple of ways, so obviously factor this in on your spectrum. If it's temp to perm, well, it depends. Again, if they're going to interview, I'd go on the higher end. If it's a short-term temp assignment and they want to convert it fast, odds are, again, depending upon what you find out, maybe they're more flexible with their bill rate. Again, if not, so what? You might decide for temp to perm, we want those conversion dollars, if indeed there's a liquidation or a conversion fee, and to get that person in, we'd be willing to come in lower on our bill rate side. Okay? Commute, again, that'll depend more upon the candidate, but if it's in a horrific location, and all markets sort of have that, you could factor that into a higher rate to get someone to work in that tough area. Okay? How much spread will you earn? I mean, do you consider this every time? Again, the people that just focus on margin and markup without looking at spread are doing a big disservice, because I've seen people walk away from markups and margin that are well lower than what they would normally do, but the spread rate is huge, right? Meaning the gross margin dollars that you have, after your pay charges and after you deduct that from your bill rate per hour. So, boy, if it's a really high-level job and you still have a ton of candidates and the spread's real good, it could go either way, meaning you might decide based upon this, I'm willing to lower it on the lower end of my spectrum, and the spread's real good. Again, in and of itself, don't make a decision on spread, because I could argue the higher the spread and the more senior the position, the less price-sensitive clients become. So again, it just depends on that client and that job order and all of these things looking at together. Okay? Buying business is the next one, right? I'm not a fan of lowering your prices to get increased business. But if you're looking to, again, just get in there and get the fill, or maybe you made a marketing call and you're going to replace a temp that exists from a competitor, then by all means you might decide that on this one I'm going to go on the real low end. Okay? And again, back to the hot buttons, the same deal. If this candidate, in particular that has all of the things that they want, then of course that should impact it and they should pay for it. Okay? So again, rocket science, first time you've heard this stuff, no and no. But are you using it for pricing and separating your bill for every order? I don't know. You answer that. Okay? Pay rate side on the pricing factor. Look, it's really the same things that we've talked about. It is the opposite of the bill rate side, but it's the same thing. So again, what are their expectations? What did they say they'd work at? What did we stretch them to? Important that you look at that at a minimum, as we mentioned, on every pay rate decision. The sexiness and sellability of the job, I think obvious, right? That goes back to hot buttons as well. But again, maybe it's just a great company everyone wants. Boom, the rate can go lower. The length of assignment, well, that depends on whether they wanted a short or a long-term assignment. If this is something and they really want to get to work and this is a one-year assignment, boy, odds are they should be willing to be a little flexible and lock that in, especially in a down economy. Okay, how high of a level is the person? Can it go temp to perm or convert to perm if that's what they wanted? If it does, of course they should be more reasonable. And you could remind them, say, look, I know you said that you really wanted 20. This one's going to pay $17.17, but hey, take a step back. It hits all your hot buttons, and it's going to convert possibly to perm if you do a good job. And then you'll be earning X thousands of dollars a year and benefits, and that's what you're trying to do. All right, commute we talked about. The length of assignment, which is on there twice. I just caught that. The desperation. Again, maybe you want to get a candidate in your arsenal and get them out to work because they're real good. You want to use them on other things. You'll be more flexible. And again, I've beaten this hot button thing to death, but how many does it meet? And that's the real key, right? So, but again, this has nothing to do with the bill rate that we're charging. So we look at this independently. okay? And then, as we mentioned, or we can go through the economic slide, okay, because I think we talked about that one. But we now use margin and markup to figure out whether we've priced maybe too much or maybe too low. Okay, so let's look at, again, some of these things we talked about, but maybe some more. And I want you to think of any of these habits that you fall into. If you are a manager, I want you to figure this out with your staff. This and the other things I talked about are the key to having you lead the pack in your margin or raise your margin to a level that you have never done before. So here are things I see happen all the time. On the pay side, you pay exactly what this temp asks for during the interview, right? That comes back to that wish versus requirement. They said they wanted 20, and that's what you're paying them. Identify if you do this. Just be honest with yourself. And again, managers, I would always go back. I would look at all the fills for the week, or, when I was in an area position, I would go in there, look at all the fills for the month, would pull them out by the individual, and we would dissect them. Okay, so this is a habit that so many people fell into, and it's easy to break if you always ask yourself this, or as a manager, if you're always discussing it and following up with it. Okay, so how many people actually went less than what they asked for? And it should be most of the time, even if it's a buck or less. It doesn't have to be $2 or $3. Okay. Next habit, and I want you to think about this. Do you do this all the time when you're coming up with a pay rate? You pay them what we pay them on their last or previous job. Right? Hey, so last job, we paid you $22 an hour, so here's a new one that comes in. By the way, I got a great job for you, and yep, we'll keep your pay rate at 22. Right? So you don't want to do that. Each pay rate should differ a bit, certainly within a range, but it should differ a bit for each job and based on the things that we talked about. And remember the example I gave before about how the person came in and told you that the hot buttons weren't there and they had to commute further, or it wasn't exactly what they wanted. So even though they told you it was 20, or they worked for you at $20 an hour on their last two jobs, for this one they need 22 or 25. Well, we know that happens. We see that all the time. But what happens is, once we give them that $25 an hour, or again 22, whatever the number is, once we give them this higher rate, guess what we almost always pay them on their next job, even if the commute is much better. Once they get that raise, once they get that increase, that becomes their new base level that you work with. So I would often, like I said, I'd pull out their job history, I'd pull out what they asked for, and I would say, okay, so this person came in here a month ago, said they wanted 20 an hour. We put them on their first job at 20, and then we put them on their second one at 25, and now you've just put them on the third one at 25. Why 25? And again, the reason is because we're just paying them on habit of what they came in on their last job, okay? Another one that maybe you don't fall into any of those, do you pay them what we paid others for a similar job in the past? Right? So you're looking at the position, at the title, and you're like, okay, well, hey, we've been paying 22, 25 on this job, so let me call you up, and this is your pay rate, 22, 25. So again, if someone's pay rates for a certain type of position constantly, are the same, odds are you're falling into a habit like that. Okay? And again, then the other way, and I did see this a lot, are people would then just pay based upon this bill rate, and then once they had the bill rate side, they divide by this markup, and that's what they come out with, and that's what they pay. I need you to figure out what you're doing and why you pay. And again, for many of you, I think this is just an eye-opener that, wow, Neil, you know what? Yeah, I'm pretty good at this, but I have definitely fallen into some regular habits, and I'm just going to take a step back, and I'm gonna look at it differently, right? So again, if I just use this when I would go to any branch or location, or when I was running the branch, it was unbelievable what I would find. And I would find, again, some themes and some branches, but I would find each individual had their different habits, and all I had to do is work with them on training, and that's what you're on this call for. So again, if you're an individual, work with yourself and say, okay, I see that I do that, and I'm going to test myself to make sure that I don't do that anymore. Okay? On the bill rate side, I think we talked about most of them, but do you bill what the client said they would pay? Again, I don't mean, long-term contracts or things that, that are written. But if they said, look, we've got some quotes from some competitors, we'll go up to, $40 an hour. Is that what you're billing them? All right. Do you bill them what you charge them the last time for the same position? And that's pretty common. It's not as flagrant as the problems that you see on the candidate side, but again, every job should be different based upon the economy and the supply and the demand, and based upon the specific person and the desperation and all that sort of stuff. So don't just fall into it. No, okay, their rate is X, and that's what we're going to do. Okay, did you bill them? And again, pull out some of your recent orders. All right, did we bill them what we billed other clients for the same position that came in last week? Right? Think about that. Do you do that? That's, again, not a way that you come up with a bill rate. It might give you an idea of where to start or a range, but that's not doing it for you, right? Okay, and then again, this is just a huge, probably the biggest flagrant one I would see, is especially if you have an independent markup or margin goal, people would figure out what markup they need to hit that margin with your pay charges, and they would take a pay rate, multiply it by this markup regardless of the hot buttons, and voila, there's your bill rate. So please be honest with yourself of where you stand there, okay? So again, I think this is critical to it. So maximize each, minimize the pay rate, come up with this thermometer. Now, what I mean by thermometer is it's okay. If it's too high, right, your markup or margin's too high, it doesn't mean it's too high. It just means you have to use it like a thermometer and say, hey, wait a minute, wow, this is coming in much higher than average or even than our goal. Perhaps is my bill rate too high, or perhaps is my pay rate too low? And just review it. And it's okay to keep some really high ones in there. If your margin or markup is really low when you do the math, say, all right, this is really low. Maybe I can get my pay rate down. Maybe I can get the bill rate up a little bit. Can I? No, I just reviewed it. I can't. Or, you know what, yeah, I think I can play with it a little more. My thermometer is telling me something doesn't look ideal. But look, your margin and your markup goal, whatever it is, and this is another key, from this session, is it needs to be an average of your fills, okay? An average of all of them. If you're working on absolutes where you have a walk-away minimum, please ask your manager to call me or watch this training, or maybe we can get you a playback of the recording. It can't be. It needs to be an average, and you want to have a really high standard deviation. Okay, remember what standard deviation means? That means if you want a goal, let's say, of a markup of 70%, and every fill is at exactly 70%, you have zero standard deviation from 70. But if you have one at 70, you have another one at 100, and another one at 40, well, guess what? Your standard deviation is now really big. You're still averaging 70. So a big standard deviation is actually great. And you want to have, not only is it okay to have fills lower than your goal or lower than your minimum. Again, your minimum or your goal, whatever, should be an average. It's okay to go in lower, but in order to go lower, you also have to get the high ones. That's where that high standard deviation comes in. So if you did this right and you priced it and you paid it out right, and you say, my God, I just got a 92% markup, that's okay, take it. Because again, if your goal is 55% and you get a 90, you could come in there and you could do a bunch of them at 40% and still end up averaging your goal. You don't just give them away to give them away, but if you do this right, you're going to see, okay, the way it worked out is I've got a pretty big standard deviation. So, again, when you look at it, losing some business, okay, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Well, it depends. If they're really inflexible and they're nowhere near what you want and you're never going to get the business, then lose it. But don't lose business just because it falls below a level for that particular day when you're trying to price it. It's okay. Because, again, my point is if I walked into a branch using my 70% example, and every order was at 70%, and even if they were like the highest margin branch at the time, I would say this is a really bad thing. Because what about those orders that you're losing that won't do us, what turned out to be like a 36% margin. They won't do this. What about ones that the only way you can do it based upon that job was 55? Oh, no, Neil, we won't do it below 70. Okay, well, what about the ones that you should have done at 85? Well, I mean, look at us. We're averaging 70%. My point is that that's not good. Have the high standard deviation and get the good margin when you can get it to pay for some of the lower margin. But again, if you look at everything separately and your margin for that one order comes in lower, then okay, that's the way it's meant to be. Just make sure you get on the higher side. And, when it comes to these habits, people are afraid to sometimes come in at a really high, markup or margin. Again, we're running a bit out of time, but we're doing okay. We'll wrap this up in a few. Often it takes someone to show that you can get the high margins. I mean, many times, especially when working in larger branches, it would take someone from a high margin branch that had high margin habits, or that we hired from a competitor that was used to pricing high, that would come into a branch, and again, maybe they had bad habits, but they would mark up everything at, I'm looking at retail, let's call it 80%, which is a huge markup. And they would come into that branch on day one, mark up things at 80%, and see, my goodness, this person this week just filled a bunch of orders at 80% that we haven't seen in a year. People are creatures of habit. And, and when it comes to habit, and I'm not insulting anyone, but I talk about a lot of psychological studies, that you need to shatter and break these habits. You need to just have the conviction and, frankly, the discipline to try it and to break these. There are studies that show that carp in a pond, if you put in clear glass, in the beginning, they'll constantly run into the glass as they're trying to, swim across the small pond or whatever it is. And after a while, when you lift that glass out, well, they don't even cross that barrier. It's just a psychological barrier for them that they never leave the other side of the pond ever again. There's stories about fleas in jars. I've heard a story, whether it's true or not. No, I'm not in the circus, but it seems to make sense. I heard that the way that they train elephants, for the circus so that they don't run through town, is that they train them with poles in the ground that are dug in cement, 10 feet into the ground with steel poles. And so as they're little baby elephants, they try like heck to escape, right? They just flop everywhere and they do their thing, and they soon learn that that pole's not going anywhere. This way, when the circus is in town and they, tap in, with their hammer that pole that any grown-up elephant can knock down in a heartbeat, they don't even try anymore. So my point is, you need to believe that all of this is so easy to do and very doable. But when it comes to, breaking that glass barrier or, breaking the pole down at the circus, you just need to try, and you really, really need to do it, okay? So a couple of big stories there. So I think I covered the Houston red flag. And again, in the interest, I do want to keep open for some questions here. But again, just make sure there's a big standard deviation. Make sure that you look at this. I mean, do you have tools that review your per fill margin regularly, or are you just, looking at your financial statements in your branch after the fact, a month later, or looking at trends? If you don't have a bill rate target sheet, you're already in trouble. Do you have a pay rate target sheet? You're already in trouble. Do you review your own stuff weekly and dissect it just like we did here? It's easy. It doesn't take long. And you say, why did I do this? As a manager, are you doing this regularly? Do markups appear as even percentages? 50, 55, 70? That doesn't make sense. There's no way this thermometer is going to come in exactly at even numbers unless you're doing something funny. If you're looking at each bill rate separately and each pay rate, then that's not going to happen. Okay? Do you want black and white rules for pricing? So many people do. And people want a walk-away number, but I already shared with you why that's really super dangerous. Okay, know your inventory. I think we talked about that. And again, I think we talked about the whole averages and your margin goal. And, one quick story here is, you might say, Neil, you're crazy. I'm a manager, and my division actually has, pretty good margins. I guess you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't be on this call. But I actually had this happen when I started at my old company, one of my first weeks. And they said, Neil, we're already pricing it really super high, and we're going to lose business. So, there were 5 or 6 people placing temporaries in there, so I dissected all of them, put stuff in a spreadsheet and in a database, and I looked at it, and I said, well, I got news for you. I'll show you how we can raise your margin higher than 70%, and we won't lose business. And the way I proved it to them was that 3 of them on certain positions were always higher than the other 3. So, the person that said, oh, no, we can't go any higher, we got the right amount there, I said, well, great, look at you. You're pricing out this. This one's pricing out, $1.50 less per hour than you are. So are you too high or are they too low? No, I've gotten away with this forever. All right, then let's work on the people that are bringing the average actually down so we can raise some of those people. So my point is, don't look at statistics after the fact. And none of that stuff really works other than that being a report card of whether you succeeded or not. Okay? You just have to look and understand all of this. Last real tip I'm going to leave for you is this is a great way, and you've all heard tips like this before, but it's a great way to break the bad habits for yourself and if you're a manager for your team. And that means paying these off-dollar amounts. Look, try to carve 19 cents off of each bill and pay rate that you have. Right? I mean, if you have an office with just 50 temps working, I mean, that's 40,000 extra bucks by something that requires very little discipline. Right? Meaning, if you hired someone at $30,000 a year to just police this and pay them benefits, they'd pay for themselves, right? Obviously, you're not going to need someone to do that. Okay? The margin isn't the point to this. Okay? That's great. It's gravy, but it helps you break the habit and at the same time get you this great gravy. Okay? The off-dollar amounts, look, someone says 20 is their rock bottom. Okay, they'll work for $19.81. You just are a little chicken to ask them all the time. Once you get in the habit of doing this, you'll see they really don't. And those that scoff, you just explain that's the way it worked out. So I know you said 20. Really, 19 cents before taxes? Look, and you're not going to be sarcastic to them, right? But, again, they'll do it. And, same on the client side. I mean, so they were going to pay, $40 was their max. You think if you came up with $40.19 that the majority of the people would end up scoffing? They don't. They don't, okay? So try this all the time. Once it breaks the habit, it'll stop, you having those crazy margins and markups that are X percent. And by the way, if you do this on every fill you have in the next month, and let's say you have a manager that insists that you can't fill something below a certain markup, well, guess what? You just have all this extra margin that you've just built that's going to work, okay? So I'm not going to get into the lowering your prices for volume other than it doesn't work. Those of you who want to see this, I have a free video on my website. It's also on YouTube about this. You can just check it out. It's www.thedynamicsale.com. You can see that at the bottom of the screen. Sign up for my free training, but also check out the free video gallery, and there's a lowering your prices for volume. I also do a quicker version of this gross margin method as part of the training that's on there, so I think that could help you. So this isn't the time really to do it. And I was going to look at getting into increases your pricing with the caveat that a business slowdown or recession isn't the best time to do it, but it can really happen. So, I guess at this point I want to see, since we're an hour into it, if we have any questions. And again, you guys, if you want any of these handouts, you can let me know. These are just basic objections. So do we have any questions out there from the group? Please feel free to shoot them. Questions? All right. Mark, let me know if anyone's popping up. We'll wait for some questions. In the interim, I really just wanted to make sure that you all take a step back. I hope you got what you expected today. I'm not going to give you any scripts. I'm not going to give you any of the same old, but this is really easy to do. When I tell you, like I opened with, that this was phenomenally successful, it's an incredible understatement. Anytime I work with an individual, a sales rep, a branch manager, an area manager, and I wanted to get their margin up, these are the things we would do. We would just take an inventory of what habits existed in the branch and the bill and the pay item by individual. Okay? We'd pull them off. We would look at them, we'd work on breaking the habits, and we would have regular follow-up until that habit was broken. It really often didn't take more than a month to get all the habits broken, and then once you have that, and especially if you're a manager, or frankly, if you're an individual as well, once you're that person in that group that's doing this and getting these margins, the other people around you will learn from you, and they will see, from you. So remember to always separate and negotiate, okay? Always deal with your bill and your pay separately. Find your habits, price and pay on off-dollar amounts. Go back to the interview, get the hot buttons and all that sort of stuff, okay? I urge any of you on there, I do see there are a couple of questions. I would love to hear your feedback on here. If you just go to my website, hit contact me, that'll be great. Or you see my name there, it's Neil.Leibovitz at thedynamicsale.com. I would really love if you just took 20 seconds to give any feedback.
Neil, I do have one question. I got two questions in the queue. One of them is how do we get a copy of the presentation? And we do have a PDF of today's slides available. You can write Neil or you can write me, Mark at SWATrecruiting.com, and either one of us would be able to turn around and get that to you. The other question is, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding this 100%, but how do you handle prospects who say you are too high? And then it says they get good service for a lower rate. I guess that's another thing that they might say to you. How do you handle that?
Yep. It actually will be in the slides a little bit if you want it. There's never an easy answer to any one of them. What you need to do, Vicki, is look at all of the points that we talked about on the billing slide. So to say it in a vacuum, if this position's been open a long time, if they're having a tough time finding it, or if they're interviewing the person, these are all different factors. So then, again, if they're interviewing, look, be your own judge. You're not going to end up bringing them on unless you think that they're worth the money, and so you sort of have all those closes. But everyone says that. Expect your clients to tell you that you're too high. So if they're a onesie or a twosie, go to the higher end. You might be overpriced. Again, odds are if you're constantly hearing that, you're not on this call to raise your margins. Your issue is, how can you really lower your margins maybe to get more, in sync with the market. So again, each client is going to be very different. They will tell you that, and that's their job. And it's a candidate's job also to tell you that they need more than they're really going to take. My point is deal with all of this. And if you have some that are just so firm, again, if they've dealt with you and they like your service, then odds are they'll be willing to pay a little more. If they're brand new then and you can't crack it because they say you're too high and we're getting better service from others lower, then again, Vicki, that might come in where this is one where you're going to use some of the margin you got from the other or the lower pay rate side that you were able to get based upon the needs of this hot button to come in perhaps at a lower margin on this one. The point is this works with any situation. And like always, try to figure out, how high too high is it as well.
Yeah. Neil, that's wonderful. There's just one more question here about the PowerPoint again. Hey, could you give your email address one more time to everybody?
Yes. Like I said, you can go to thedynamicsale.com and just hit Contact Neil on the tabs, or it's Neil. You see the spelling at the bottom, Neil.Leibovitz, L-E-B as in boy, O-V as in Victor, I-T as in Tom, S as in Sam, at thedynamicsale.com.
So
also,
you can
sign up for the free training too. It's really good stuff.
You can write Neil or myself at Mark at SWATrecruiting.com for the handout of today, and either one of us will be happy to do that. Neil, what a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed sitting through it today. I was muted, but listening intently to hanging on every word. I think anybody that is in the temp business would do themselves well to heed your good advice today. I also want to thank everybody that attended. Keep in mind we've got Jeff Kay at 1:30 Central Time today doing his closing session, and I'm sure it'll be a good one. He's a wonderful speaker as well, so be sure and be there. Meanwhile, Neil, thanks again. What a wonderful presentation.
All right.